In future years, when historians look back and write about this time period, terrorism will be a major buzzword. Terrorism is defined as an act of extreme violence to intimidate an opponent. Terrorist groups have been a dominant factor in modern global politics. They are especially difficult to defeat because most of them are stateless organizations, meaning they are not supported by or tied to any single nation. Thus, they can jump over borders, play foreign powers against each other, and exploit the weaknesses in international security. Although there are many threats in this modern world, in this lesson we are going to focus on two of the most notorious, Al-Qaeda and ISIL. As Americans, one of the first things that comes to mind when we think about terrorism is the violent extremist group Al-Qaeda, the group responsible for the World Trade Center attack of 9/11. Al-Qaeda groups rely on a radical interpretation of Islam and were founded in a period of immense violence. Their origins date back to the Cold War, a period when the United States and Soviet Union fought to establish capitalist versus communist regimes around the world. The Soviet Union actively intervened in Afghanistan and helped the nation's armed forces fight against rebel insurgencies. The rebels, however, were being supported by anti-Soviet nations like the United States, who provided billions in weapons and supplies. The war was long and extremely violent, leading to the rise of more radical tactics by the rebels. Out of this group, extremist leaders like Osama bin Laden formed Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda terrorism is often misunderstood as a purely religious struggle or a hate of large capitalist nations. While they are religiously founded, the motivation for most actions seems to be opposition to foreign powers interfering in the Middle East. Specifically, actions that are considered to be harmful to Muslim populations are opposed through violent attacks meant to impose or intimidate. In other words, acts of terror. Anything from the rise of American business in Middle Eastern oil fields to the support of Israel could be deemed damaging to Muslim interests in the eyes of Al-Qaeda. At its height, Al-Qaeda performed major acts of terror in nations around the world. Prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy buildings in 1998. They were also behind the deadly 2002 bombings of Bali, Indonesia. However, after the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011, Al-Qaeda dissolved from a centralized, organized unit into smaller groups of independent radicals. With the decline of Al-Qaeda, new terror threats have emerged. One of the most notorious is the group called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. ISIL was founded in 1999 and grew in notoriety as a major insurgency group against the American invasion of Iraq for its brutal tactics and violations of human rights. Although allied with Al-Qaeda for a time, they severed those ties in 2014. ISIL is notorious for massive war crimes, including attacks on civilian populations. There are currently 60 nations in the world that have declared war against ISIL. ISIL is very well funded and has managed to capture significant territory in Syria and Iraq after the Syrian civil war. In 2014, they declared that they were a caliphate, an Islamic state ruled by a caliph, the political and religious leader of a Muslim community. This move was deeply controversial and protested by mainstream Muslims around the world who want no association between their religion and the radical extremist groups. Terrorism, or acts of extreme violence to intimidate, is a big part of our world. At a cost of billions of dollars and millions of human lives, terrorism is a major focus. Since most terrorist groups are stateless, existing without being affiliated with a single nation, they can be difficult to capture. One major group is Al-Qaeda, an organization of radical Islamic extremists who formed from an extremely violent war against the Soviet Union and opposed the interference of Western powers in the Middle East. Another major terrorist group is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. They currently control part of Iraq and Syria and have declared themselves to be a caliphate. Moderate Muslims around the world have protested this and want no affiliation with the terrorist organization. International communities, and the greater Muslim community as well, are working towards solutions to stop the violence and end the reign of terror in the Middle East.